Rick Ross just got publicly embarrassed on a scale that hip-hop hasn't seen in over a decade, and by the time you finish watching this, you're going to understand exactly why the entire industry is laughing at him behind closed doors. Rick Ross spent months on the biggest promotional run of his career, told everybody who would listen that Drake wasn't on his level, laughed at Iceman, mocked 50 Cent, hinted at Jay-Z, and swore up and down that Set in Stone was going to be the album of the year. And then the first week numbers dropped, and Rick Ross became a walking punchline. Before we go any further, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and stand with us, because the losers, the copers, and the Boz Bailout Brigade are already flooding the comments trying to spin this disaster into a victory. And we're not letting them get away with it. Happy Saturday, hip-hop family. Buckle up, because this one is uglier than anyone predicted. Let me paint the picture the way the streets are seeing it right now. Rick Ross, 20-year veteran, MMG boss, luxury rap architect, the man who once moved 150,000 units in a first week without breaking a sweat, just released Set in Stone. Rick Ross moved 17,200 units. Of those 17,000, roughly 2,000 were physical copies. And then Tory Lanez, a man who is literally sitting behind bars, a man who did 0 interviews, 0 podcast runs, 0 red carpets, 0 TikTok trends, and 0 radio promotion, pushed 19,700 units with the album Made You Think I Was Gone. Rick Ross got outsold by a man in a prison jumpsuit. Not by a margin. By 2,500 units. And Rick Ross didn't just get outsold. Rick Ross got exposed. Because the numbers aren't the story. The story is what those numbers mean when you stack them against everything Rick Ross said with his chest for the last 6 months. See, here's the part the copers don't want you to remember. Rick Ross was the loudest man in the room. Rick Ross went on every podcast that would book him. Rick Ross sat down with Patrick Bet-David, sat down with Joe Budden, sat down with Big Boy, sat down with anybody holding a microphone. And every single time Rick Ross opened his mouth, Rick Ross made sure to say something about Drake. Drake's music was horrendous. Drake didn't write his own bars. Drake wasn't on Rick Ross's level. Iceman was a flop, Rick Ross said. Iceman was ass, Rick Ross said. Rick Ross even pushed his own album release date back, not once, but multiple times, to avoid getting steamrolled by Drake's 5th-week momentum. And guess what happened anyway? Rick Ross still got outsold. Not by Drake this time. By Tory Lanez. From prison. Let me repeat that so it sinks in, because this is the part that broke the internet. Tory Lanez, incarcerated, with no rollout, no press tour, no algorithm push, no radio spins, no cover stories, outsold Rick Ross by 2,500 units in a single week. And Rick Ross had literally spent 4 months building anticipation, dropping snippets, teasing features, going on Patrick Bet-David's podcast to explain why he was the biggest to ever do it, and swearing that Set in Stone was going to change hip-hop forever. It did change hip-hop forever. Just not the way Rick Ross wanted it to. Now let me bring in the man who lit the fuse on this whole meltdown, because this story doesn't stop at the sales chart. Tony Yayo, the G-Unit soldier who has been quietly watching from the sidelines, saw those numbers drop and immediately stepped to the microphone. Tony Yayo didn't hold back. Tony Yayo said what everybody in the industry was thinking, but nobody was brave enough to publish. Tony Yayo pointed out that Rick Ross had every single advantage a legacy artist could ask for: the interviews, the podcast circuit, the social media campaign, the physical distribution, the MMG machine. And Rick Ross still got dusted by a man serving time. Tony Yayo asked out loud who told Rick Ross that it was a good idea to disappear from music for 2 decades, then drop an album, then try to book a world tour, then run his mouth at every rapper still standing. Whoever gave Rick Ross that advice, Tony Yayo said, doesn't love Rick Ross. That line right there, that line went viral in under 3 hours. And here's where the wheels really come off. Because just as the industry was digesting Tony Yayo's takedown, Curtis Jackson entered the chat. 50 Cent, the eternal boogeyman of Rick Ross's career, saw the sales figures, opened up Instagram, screenshotted the projections, and posted them with the caption, "I just saw your record sales, LOL. 2000. What the expletive? 50 Cent didn't need to write a diss track. 50 Cent didn't need to book a studio. 50 Cent needed 40 characters and an emoji, and 50 Cent buried Rick Ross with them. And the second 50 Cent hit send, the entire hip-hop internet turned into a bonfire. Because if there is one man on this planet who has been waiting 2 decades for this exact moment, it is Curtis Jackson. 50 Cent has been watching Rick Ross build an empire on beats, wings, and cognac while quietly counting the days until the empire cracked. And the empire just cracked. Now pause with me for a second, because I want you to sit with the psychology of what Rick Ross is doing next. Because Rick Ross's response to all of this is arguably more embarrassing than the sales themselves. Rick Ross gets on Instagram Live and starts talking about Basquiat. Rick Ross tells his fans that when Basquiat was painting, Basquiat didn't know what the paintings would be worth, and that generations from now people will look back and realize Set in Stone was a masterpiece. Rick Ross compared himself to Basquiat. 2,000 physical copies sold, and Rick Ross is on the boat, in a bathrobe, comparing himself to one of the greatest visual artists in modern history. This is the part where the hip-hop internet lost its mind. Because there is a certain type of denial that only sets in after a public humiliation of this magnitude, and Rick Ross was performing that denial in real time, live on camera, for millions of people to screenshot. But we're not done. Because now we have to talk about the algorithm. And we have to talk about it seriously, because Rick Ross himself brought it up. When asked point-blank whether the algorithm was working against him, Rick Ross said, and I quote, "Yeah, I would say so." And when asked whether that was because Rick Ross had spent months attacking Drake, Rick Ross basically confirmed it. Rick Ross admitted, on camera, that his own rollout was polluted by his obsession with Drake. Rick Ross admitted that his interviews weren't about Set in Stone. Rick Ross admitted that his podcast appearances weren't about the music. Rick Ross admitted that the reason so many people showed up to hear him talk was because they wanted to hear him take shots at Drake. And the moment Rick Ross stopped taking shots at Drake and tried to sell an album, the audience walked. That is the coldest, most brutal case study in fan psychology hip-hop has produced in years. DJ academics love him, hate him, block him, tune into him. Academics spent an entire live stream explaining exactly what happened. Academics broke it down mathematically. Academics said the pick-a-side culture in hip-hop right now is dominated by Drake fans. Academics said Drake fans make up roughly 70% of the hip-hop audience. Academics said Ross fans make up maybe 15%. And academics said that of that 15%, almost every Ross fan is also a Drake fan, but not every Drake fan is a Ross fan. Which means the moment Rick Ross went to war with Drake, Rick Ross detonated 50 to 80% of his own crossover audience. Academics called it a suicide play. And when you look at the 17,200 number, it's hard to argue with academics. Now here comes the twist nobody is talking about. Because the pressure isn't just coming from the numbers. The pressure is coming from the tour. Rick Ross announced a 20-year anniversary world tour on the back of Set in Stone. And the tour is not selling. Photos from Rick Ross's venue in Miami, his home city, the place where Rick Ross should be selling out arenas without lifting a finger, show a sea of green dots. Green dots mean unsold seats. And Rick Ross's team, in panic mode, started offering buy one get 50% off ticket discounts. Rick Ross's team is running Groupon-style promotions on a tour they announced as the biggest tour of his career. In Miami. His backyard. Let that image live in your head for a second. Rick Ross, on the boat, in a bathrobe, comparing himself to Basquiat, running 2-for-1 deals on tour tickets in his own hometown. And this is where the receipts start stacking up in ways that make even Rick Ross's loyalists uncomfortable. Because Rick Ross's album isn't just underperforming, Rick Ross's album is being outstreamed by single songs. A single Drake song, dropped earlier this year, allegedly outperformed the entire Set in Stone album in daily streams. The full album, the entire 14-track project, beaten by one Drake record in a single afternoon. That is not a competitive gap. That is a canyon. And when you stack that against Rick Ross's public statements that Iceman was a flop, that Drake was washed, that Drake was 3 albums into being irrelevant, the schadenfreude becomes almost cinematic. Because Rick Ross said Iceman flopped. Iceman moved hundreds of thousands of units. Rick Ross said Drake was washed. Drake is topping streaming charts. Rick Ross said Drake wasn't on his level. Rick Ross just got outsold by a rapper in a jail cell. Let me hand you another receipt, because Yayo wasn't done. Yayo pointed to the fact that Rick Ross's biggest records, the songs that built the second half of Rick Ross's career, all featured Drake. Gold Roses, Aston Martin Music, Freemason, Lemon Pepper Freestyle, Money in the Grave. Every one of Rick Ross's post-2010 anthems had Drake's fingerprints on it. And the moment Rick Ross burned that bridge, Rick Ross didn't just lose a collaborator. Rick Ross lost the algorithmic tailwind that had been carrying his catalog for the last 15 years. Because every time a casual listener searched for a Drake track and found Rick Ross featured on it, that was a free stream. That was free discovery. That was free momentum. And Rick Ross set it on fire because Rick Ross thought he could outsmart a machine that has more data on human music consumption than any single artist on the planet. Now let's talk about the music itself, because even Rick Ross's most loyal defenders are having trouble spinning the tracklist. 14 out of the 19 tracks on Set in Stone are features. 14 features. On a Rick Ross album. In year 20 of his career. Which raises a question that 50 Cent has been screaming from Shreveport. How does an artist with over 20 features on a single project only move 10,000 streams? How does the math work? Because the math doesn't work. And the math not working is exactly the reason 50 Cent has been cackling on Instagram every 12 hours for the last 2 weeks. 50 Cent posted screenshots. 50 Cent posted video reactions. 50 Cent posted memes. 50 Cent said Rick Ross needed the Drake stimulus package. 50 Cent said Rick Ross needed a Drake care package. 50 Cent said Rick Ross needed a Drake care package feat 1 bar of Aubrey to save the entire album. And every single one of those posts hit tens of thousands of likes in minutes. Rick Ross, of course, tried to fire back. Rick Ross went online and told 50 Cent to give the Shreveport people their money back. Rick Ross accused 50 Cent of borrowing from the city, overpromising on a film studio, and running off before delivering. Rick Ross tried to flip the narrative. And to his credit, some of Rick Ross's core supporters ran with it. But here is the ugly truth: nobody cared. Because when your album is doing 2,000 physical copies, your comeback tweets don't have the same weight. When your tour is running Groupon discounts, your accusations don't land. When Basquiat is your defense, the courtroom stops taking you seriously. Rick Ross tried to punch up at 50 Cent, and 50 Cent didn't even flinch. 50 Cent just posted another screenshot. Now here comes the part that connects everything, and this is the part one want you to sit with. Because there is a pattern in hip-hop history, and Rick Ross just walked right into it. Every time an artist declares war on Drake, every single time, that artist's numbers collapse within 12 months. It happened to Meek Mill. It happened to Pusha T in the long game. It happened to Joe Budden in a different way. And now it is happening to Rick Ross in the most public way any of them have ever experienced. Because Drake doesn't have to respond. Drake doesn't have to drop a diss track. Drake doesn't have to pick up the phone. Drake just has to keep making music, and the algorithm does the rest. Drake has spent a decade building the most efficient content delivery engine hip-hop has ever seen, and that engine doesn't care about beef. That engine cares about streams. And Rick Ross unplugged himself from that engine the day Rick Ross decided to make Drake his marketing strategy. And the sermon nobody is delivering yet is this: Rick Ross forgot the one rule of the streaming era. Rick Ross forgot that in 2026, hit songs sell albums. Podcasts don't sell albums. Interviews don't sell albums. Beef doesn't sell albums. Hit songs sell albums. Drake has hit songs coming out of his pores. Tory Lanez, even from behind bars, has hit songs. Rick Ross has speeches about Basquiat. And when you don't have a hit, and Rick Ross hasn't had a certified radio hit since BMF, and BMF dropped a decade ago, the algorithm sees you as legacy inventory. And legacy inventory doesn't get pushed. Legacy inventory gets shelved. And Rick Ross just discovered, on national television, in real time, that he is legacy inventory now. The Joe Budden appearance is going to be studied in marketing classes for the next 10 years. Because Rick Ross went on Joe Budden expecting a coronation. Joe Budden asked Rick Ross about Drake. Rick Ross said there was no back and forth, just one train on the track. Joe Budden asked Rick Ross whether he was squashing the beef. Rick Ross deflected. Joe Budden asked Rick Ross about the album. Rick Ross pivoted back to Drake. Every single question Rick Ross was asked about his own project, Rick Ross found a way to turn back into a shot at Drake. Which is exactly what killed him. Because the audience showed up wanting to hear the disses. The audience did not show up wanting to buy the album. And Rick Ross gave the audience exactly what they came for: free entertainment, while assuming they would then reward him with $16 for a physical copy. They did not. They screenshotted the disses, they laughed, they scrolled, and they moved on. Set in Stone had strong moments. Let me give Rick Ross credit where credit is due, because the Copers deserve at least one truth to hold on to. The YFN Lucci feature is genuinely strong. Some of the production is top tier. Rick Ross's pen is still one of the sharpest in the genre when he decides to write. But here is the harsh reality: nobody bought the album to find out. Nobody streamed the album to find out. The audience made up its mind about Set in Stone before the album ever dropped, and the audience made up its mind based on how Rick Ross carried himself for the 6 months leading into the release. Rick Ross carried himself like a man who was still living in 2012. And in 2026, that persona doesn't sell records anymore. There is also a quiet subplot playing out with Tony Yayo, and I want you to keep your eye on it. Because Yayo isn't just clowning Ross for sport. Yayo is doing something strategic. Yayo is planting a flag on behalf of 50 Cent, keeping the G-Unit narrative alive, and building content for the exact demographic that grew up watching the 50 Cent versus Rick Ross saga unfold in the 2000s. Yayo is essentially doing free publicity for the G-Unit brand every time he opens his mouth about Set in Stone. And every viral clip of Yayo dunking on Ross is another data point that the streaming algorithm reads and files. 50 Cent knows this. Yayo knows this. That is why the posts keep coming. That is why the screenshots keep dropping. That is why the memes keep circulating. Because in the attention economy, Rick Ross's flop is somebody else's algorithmic goldmine. Meanwhile, Drake has not said a single word publicly about any of this. Drake has not posted. Drake has not subtweeted. Drake has not liked a comment. Drake has not appeared on a podcast. Drake has done what Drake always does. Drake has stayed in his lane, kept dropping music, and let the numbers do the talking for him. And the numbers are talking so loud right now that Rick Ross can barely hear himself over the noise. Because every day another chart update drops, and every day the gap widens, and every day another commentator picks up the story and runs it again. And every time the story runs, Drake's name gets attached to Rick Ross's failure. Which means, ironically, that Rick Ross's obsession with Drake is now the single biggest driver of Drake's continued relevance in this news cycle. Rick Ross is providing free marketing for the very man Rick Ross swore was washed. The Basquiat comparison is going to age badly. I want to say that on the record right now, so we can all come back to this video in 6 months and look at what happened. Because artists who have to publicly explain their own genius after a flop rarely recover. History is a graveyard of rappers who reached for Basquiat when the sales sheet reached back for them. And Rick Ross, for all his brilliance, for all his catalog, for all his business acumen, just handed his critics the exact soundbite they needed to run this story for another 6 months. Every time Rick Ross drops a new interview, somebody will play the Basquiat clip. Every time a new sales figure drops, somebody will play the Basquiat clip. The Basquiat clip is now the meme that will chase Rick Ross for the rest of the rollout. And then there is the question of what Rick Ross does next. Because Rick Ross has real options. Rick Ross has Wingstop. Rick Ross has real estate. Rick Ross has the car show. Rick Ross has publishing. Rick Ross has licensing. Rick Ross has one of the most diversified income portfolios in modern hip-hop. And nobody is disputing that. Even 50 Cent, when he stops laughing for a second, will admit that Rick Ross is going to be financially fine. But financial survival is not the same as cultural relevance. And cultural relevance is what Set in Stone was supposed to buy back. Set in Stone was supposed to replant Rick Ross's flag at the center of the conversation. Set in Stone was supposed to prove that Rick Ross was still a top 5 rapper alive. Set in Stone was supposed to silence the doubters. Instead, Set in Stone became the doubters' loudest evidence. Here is the meta question, and this is the one I want you dropping in the comments, because this is the one that is going to decide how the next 12 months of hip-hop unfold. Is Rick Ross finished, or is Rick Ross about to pull off the greatest recovery arc in modern rap? Because both outcomes are on the table. Rick Ross could double down, drop another album, silence the noise, and re-enter the conversation on his own terms. Or Rick Ross could keep talking about Basquiat, keep running discount tours, keep beefing with 50 Cent on Instagram, and slowly fade into the legacy artist tier that streaming has quietly built for aging superstars. Both paths are live. Both paths are visible. And which path Rick Ross chooses is going to be the single most watched storyline in hip-hop for the rest of this year. Let me leave you with one more receipt, because this one matters. When Rick Ross was in his prime, when Teflon Don was moving units, when God Forgives I Don't was rewriting the luxury rap playbook, when Hood Billionaire was still respected, Rick Ross had one competitive edge that separated him from every other rapper on the roster. Rick Ross could make you feel rich when you were broke. Rick Ross could put you in a Maybach when you were riding the bus. Rick Ross could put you on a yacht when you were in a studio apartment. That was the sonic contract Rick Ross signed with his audience. And Rick Ross broke that contract the day Rick Ross decided to become a beef aggregator instead of a fantasy architect. The audience didn't leave because Rick Ross got old. The audience left because Rick Ross stopped selling the fantasy. And in luxury rap, the fantasy is the only product. Which brings us all the way back to Kendrick Lamar, because you didn't think I was going to leave Kendrick out of this, did you? Kendrick has been quietly watching the entire hip-hop economy realign itself around the aftermath of last year's beef. Kendrick has not needed to release a single new record to remain the most discussed rapper alive. Kendrick's catalog is still charting. Kendrick's diss tracks are still on rotation. And the pattern that Rick Ross just walked into is the exact pattern Kendrick predicted would swallow every artist who tried to ride Drake's momentum without earning their own. Rick Ross tried to earn the momentum by attacking. Kendrick earned the momentum by making better records. That is the entire lesson of the last 2 years of hip-hop compressed into a single sentence. Make better records. Rick Ross forgot the assignment, and the class is grading in public. The final piece I want to leave with you is this. Rick Ross still has the pen. Rick Ross still has the voice. Rick Ross still has the catalog. Rick Ross still has the machine. Everything Rick Ross needs to come back is already in the room. But Rick Ross has to make a decision, and Rick Ross has to make it fast. Because the streaming era does not wait for legacy artists to sort out their egos. The streaming era moves on. The streaming era finds the next dopamine hit. The streaming era already has Tory Lanez in prison outselling Rick Ross on a laptop and a prayer. Which means the ceiling of what an artist can achieve without traditional promotion has been permanently raised. And the floor of what a legacy artist can survive with all the traditional promotion in the world has been permanently lowered. Rick Ross is standing on that lowered floor right now, staring up at that raised ceiling and running the math in his head. The Boz Bailout Brigade is going to flood the comments. The Copers are going to say the sales don't matter. The Rose Rescue Squad is going to tell you that Rick Ross is an entrepreneur, not a rapper, and that entrepreneurs don't need chart positions. And they're half right, Rick Ross is a genius entrepreneur. But Rick Ross also released a rap album called Set in Stone in year 20 of his career and told everybody who would listen that it was the album of the year. And when you make that promise out loud, the market cashes the check. The market cashed the check. The check bounced. Everything else is footnotes. So the question I want you to answer down below is this: do you think Rick Ross recovers from this, or is this the beginning of the end of the Rosie era in mainstream hip-hop? Was Tony Yayo right to compare Set in Stone to Tory Lanez's prison cell victory, or is that comparison unfair given the circumstances? Was 50 Cent's Instagram roast fair game, or was Curtis Jackson punching a man who was already down? And here is the wild card. Do you think Rick Ross should just call Drake, squash the beef, feature Aubrey on the deluxe version of Set in Stone, and reset the entire narrative in one move? Because that option is still on the table, whether Rick Ross wants to admit it or not. Drop your take in the comments, because the comment section on this one is going to be legendary. If Set in Stone taught us anything, it taught us that the audience always gets the last word, and right now the audience is speaking louder than any promotional campaign Rick Ross could have run. If you made it this far, you already know what to do. Smash that like button, hit subscribe, share this with the hip-hop fan in your group chat who has been arguing about this for 2 weeks straight, and check the suggested video on your screen right now, because the next chapter of this story is already unfolding. The 50 Cent vs. Rick Ross Round 2 is loading. The Drake response, if it ever comes, is loading. The Tory Lanez appeal is loading. And the algorithm is watching every one of us decide which story to click on next. Make sure the next story you click on is the one where we break down exactly what Drake does next, because when Drake finally speaks, and Drake will speak, eventually, the entire hip-hop landscape is going to shift again. The register is closed on Set in Stone. But the register on this saga is wide open. And we will be there when it rings.